Green River Valley, autumn 1827. A hunter named Gideon Fletcher had been positioned behind a toppled pine for close to an hour, observing a group of mule deer grazing in a meadow 200 yards beneath his location. He had covered less than a quarter mile over the preceding 3 hours. To the young trapper who had reached the Rocky Mountain Fur Company's camp 14 days prior, Fletcher's hunting approach appeared completely irrational. The newcomer had devoted the previous day to traversing 5 miles through mountain terrain, shooting at far-off deer, only to arrive back at camp with nothing and completely spent. Fletcher, advancing at what seemed like a ridiculously sluggish pace, had delivered a plump buck each time he ventured out. The young trapper eventually confronted Fletcher outright. What made him successful? How did he achieve results where others came up empty? Fletcher's response was straightforward yet puzzling. "I don't pursue the deer, I pursue the wind." Throughout the following weeks, as initial winter descended upon the Rockies, Fletcher instructed the young trapper in a technique that would revolutionize his hunting outcomes. The difference wasn't superior marksmanship or an improved firearm. The difference was grasping one crucial reality that most hunters overlooked. Deer possess a single defensive mechanism so formidable that no degree of shooting proficiency could compensate if you neglected to consider it. And after you comprehended how to leverage this mechanism's vulnerability, your success could increase twofold, occasionally threefold. Gideon Fletcher represented a compilation of thousands of mountain men who traversed the Rockies between 1810 and 1840. The technique he embodied, however, was entirely genuine. While settlers in the East thrashed through timber with their hounds and herded deer like livestock, men similar to Fletcher had absorbed a contrasting method. They had uncovered that deer inhabit a realm governed by scent, and that controlling wind direction separated those who ate adequately from those who starved in the mountains. The technique wasn't concerned with superior firearms or additional ammunition. It was more elementary than that, and considerably harder to perfect. It demanded patience most men lacked, observation capabilities requiring years to cultivate, and a foundational transformation in your conception of hunting. The mountain men who absorbed this approach delivered meat reliably, even when companions arrived at camp without anything. They endured winters that eliminated less proficient hunters, and they accomplished everything with single-shot flintlock firearms, requiring 30 seconds for reloading. This narrates how America's mountain men transformed deer hunting through a single crucial revelation. You don't pursue the deer, you pursue the wind. The zenith of Rocky Mountain fur commerce extended from 1820 through 1840. Throughout these 20 years, approximately 3,000 men traversed the mountains separating the Mississippi River from the Pacific coastline. They arrived pursuing beaver pelts, which fetched premium values in Eastern commerce where beaver felt hats remained fashionable luxury. The demand for these pelts drove men into territories that had never witnessed European presence. They pushed into valleys so remote that mapmakers hadn't yet charted them. They established camps in locations where winters could trap you for 6 consecutive months. Beaver trapping, however, was a seasonal occupation. The pelts achieved prime quality only during winter and initial spring. Throughout the remaining months, these men required sustenance. That necessitated hunting, and hunting in the Rockies demanded completely different skills than what most men brought from the East. The mountain men reached the West carrying Kentucky long rifles, alternatively termed Pennsylvania rifles, which had functioned adequately hunting white-tailed deer throughout eastern timber. These firearms typically measured 40 through 45 caliber, featuring barrels extending 42 inches or beyond. They were precise weapons, competent at striking targets across 200 yards with practiced hands. They carried a single crucial constraint. They were single-shot flintlocks demanding time for reloading. You received one opportunity. Missing or experiencing powder ignition failure meant the deer vanished. No subsequent shot existed. This constraint indicated mountain men couldn't depend on hunting approaches common in the East, where hunter groups drove deer toward positioned shooters or where hounds pursued deer until close-range shooting became possible. Throughout the Rockies, a mountain man characteristically hunted independently or alongside a single companion. The immense distances, potentially antagonistic groups present, and straightforward fur trade economics indicated large hunting assemblies proved impractical. A man required the capability to approach deer soundlessly, achieve particular range, and execute the initial shot successfully. There was no room for error, no opportunity for correction. The first shot had to count, or you went hungry. The practical range of these Kentucky rifles measured roughly 100 yards for clean deer kills. Past that distance, precision deteriorated considerably, and diminished powder quantities used for ammunition conservation indicated the ball might lack adequate energy, guaranteeing swift, merciful kills. Near was perpetually superior. Approaching deer closely, however, presented the difficulty. Deer maintain three fundamental defensive mechanisms: sight, sound detection, and odor detection. Among these three, their scent detection proves overwhelmingly the most acute and dependable. A deer's nasal system houses approximately 297 million odor receptors, contrasted with roughly 5 million throughout humans. They detect human odor across hundreds of yards given favorable circumstances. More significantly, deer trust their nasal sense unconditionally. They might examine suspicious sounds or visuals, yet detecting danger through odor triggers immediate flight without pause. A deer might tolerate a strange noise. It might study an unusual shape, but the instant it catches human scent, it's gone. The initial mountain men absorbed this through difficult experience. Hunters familiar with eastern forests, where dominant winds proved relatively foreseeable and terrain characteristics remained gentler, discovered the Rockies introduced distinctive complications. Mountain geography generates intricate wind configurations. Air ascends mountain flanks as sunlight warms them throughout morning, then descends as they cool throughout evening. Valleys funnel wind toward unanticipated directions. Even during apparently tranquil days, delicate air flows transport your odor in configurations alerting deer substantially before you observe them. A man could study the treetops and believe the wind blew from the north, yet at ground level where deer lived, subtle currents might carry his scent in completely opposite directions. The mountains created their own weather, their own air movements, their own invisible highways of scent that required years to understand. The mountain men who persisted and flourished were individuals who absorbed reading these wind configurations and situating themselves appropriately. This understanding established the basis of their designation, still hunting, a technique merging extreme patience alongside meticulous wind direction consideration. Still hunting wasn't indigenous to mountain men. The technique possessed origins in native hunting approaches and had been implemented by certain eastern hunters across generations. The mountain men, however, refined it toward artistic mastery, modifying it distinctly for Western geography and the difficulties of hunting independently with single-shot firearms. The fundamental concept was elementary. Advance gradually through deer territory, halting regularly for observation and listening, progressing solely when confident, No deer occupy sight or auditory range. The implementation, however, proved anything except elementary. A still hunter might devote a complete day traversing under 1 mile. He would advance several steps, then remain stationary for 5, 10, occasionally 20 minutes, examining the geography ahead, seeking any deer indication. His vision would pursue the horizontal contour of a deer's spine among perpendicular tree trunks, the motion of an ear, the pale reflection of a tail, the delicate motion of a deer's skull during feeding. He looked for things that didn't belong, a curve in a world of straight lines, movement where everything should be still, a patch of color that seemed out of place. The decisive element distinguishing accomplished still hunters from unsuccessful ones was wind consciousness. A mountain man implementing still hunting would initiate each hunt establishing wind direction. Some transported a modest portion of milkweed fiber or cord attached to their firearm, which they could release observing how airflow shifted. Others merely moistened a finger holding it elevated, sensing which surface cooled swiftest. The most practiced could frequently detect delicate air shifts merely remaining motionless and concentrating. They felt it on their cheeks, on the back of their necks, in the way the forest smells reached them. Wind wasn't just something they checked. It was something they lived with, breathed with, understood intimately. After establishing wind direction, the hunter organized his path. He never approached deer with wind behind him, which would transport his odor forward. Rather, he shifted so wind originated from the direction he anticipated locating deer, conveying their odor toward him while transporting his odor away from them. This indicated he could detect deer odor before they detected his, providing him essential, preliminary notification of their position. The musky scent of deer, especially bucks during the rut, could travel surprising distances. A practiced nose could detect them before eyes ever found them. Throughout mountainous geography, this grew more intricate. Morning heat currents ascending uphill indicated a hunter should situate himself elevated above where he anticipated deer existing, permitting his odor to ascend away from them. Throughout evening, as descending air descended downhill, he required positioning beneath the deer. Throughout the day, he perpetually monitored wind, modifying his situation or path whenever the breeze transformed. A shift in wind direction could ruin hours of careful stalking in seconds. The wind was fickle, changing with the sun's position, with cloud cover, with the temperature of the earth beneath your feet. The patience essential for productive still hunting was remarkable. A mountain man might observe a deer grazing 300 yards distant and invest 3 hours reducing the separation to 100 yards. He would shift solely when the deer's skull was lowered feeding, becoming motionless whenever it raised. Should wind shift disadvantageously, he might relinquish the pursuit completely rather than risk alerting the deer and devastating the hunting throughout that zone for days. This required a kind of discipline that went against every human instinct. The urge to move, to act, to do something was powerful. But the successful hunter learned to suppress that urge, to become as patient as the mountains themselves, to let time work for him rather than against him. Another element existed within the technique rendering it especially productive: odor diminishment. Mountain men couldn't eradicate their odor completely, yet they could reduce it and disguise it through methods providing them essential additional yards of approach distance. Their buckskin garments functioned significantly here. Deer hide, after being worn and manipulated and absorbing smoke from innumerable campfires, transported odors familiar throughout the deer's surroundings. While it wasn't a genuine concealment to a deer's nasal sense, It proved less disturbing than wool and cotton garments, transporting civilization's odor of cleaning agents and tobacco and human structures. The smoke was particularly important. A buckskin shirt that had hung near campfire smoke for months carried the scent of burned wood, which deer encountered constantly throughout their environment. It wasn't invisible to them, but it wasn't alarming either. Mountain men absorbed additional techniques from native hunters. They would occasionally massage their garments with pine foliage or sage, vegetation odors prevalent throughout the deer's territory that assisted in disguising human smell. They evaded powerfully scented sustenance before hunting. Garlic and onions were extravagances throughout the mountains regardless, yet even intensely flavored, wild meat could influence their odor. Certain mountain men elevated odor management toward another level completely. They would situate themselves with adjacent, natural characteristics disguising their odor. A hunter might position himself downwind from a mineral deposit or muddy area where powerful odors from soil and preceding deer visits overpowered his personal odor signature. Others would hunt adjacent water, where atmospheric moisture appeared suppressing odor distribution. Some even bathed in cold mountain streams before hunting, scrubbing away the concentrated human scent that accumulated over days or weeks. It was miserable work in near-freezing water, but it could mean the difference between success and failure. The merger of still hunting and wind consciousness generated a hunting approach devastatingly productive with proper execution. Contemporary records from the fur commerce period describe individual hunters who seldom arrived at camp lacking meat, even when hunting circumstances proved demanding. These proficient hunters became valuable brigade participants, accountable for maintaining their associates fed, while company men concentrated on trapping. A single technique especially exemplified the mountain man's deer hunting approach involved what contemporary terminology might designate terrain interpretation, merged with ambush methods. Rather than roaming arbitrarily through forest expecting to encounter deer, practiced hunters absorbed identifying characteristics deer utilized reliably: game paths connecting feeding and resting zones, water locations, geography characteristics channeling deer movement. A proficient mountain man could examine a terrain and forecast where deer would exist at varying times daily. Throughout early morning, deer would graze throughout meadows or openings. As daylight warmed, they would shift toward resting zones, characteristically on north-oriented slopes where forest grew denser and cooler. Throughout the evening, they would invert this configuration. Through comprehending these configurations, a hunter could situate himself along probable travel paths and remain rather than actively pursuing through forest. This ambush method, merged with wind consciousness, was conceivably the most productive technique accessible to mountain men. A hunter would locate a game path displaying recent deer usage evidence, impressions, waste, consumed vegetation. He would then examine local geography and wind configurations, discovering a situation downwind from the path where he could remain concealed. He might invest hours there, occasionally most of a day, anticipating deer passing within distance. The anticipation demanded tremendous discipline. A man positioned motionlessly for hours throughout late autumn cold, observing a path where deer might or might not materialize, confronted perpetual temptation, relinquishing the location and attempting active hunting alternatively. The cold seeped into your bones, your muscles are cramped, your mind wandered. But moving meant failure. Staying meant possibility. It was a test of will as much as a test of hunting skill. The mountain men who cultivated patience for this method discovered it reliably fruitful. Deer utilizing established paths were tranquil, advancing at consistent velocity, frequently halting for feeding, offering favorable shot possibilities. The productivity of these techniques becomes evident when we examine mountain men's survival proportions. While precise statistics prove difficult to establish, historical documents suggest practiced mountain men, individuals existing throughout the Rockies 3 or more years, seldom perished from hunger. Accidents eliminated them. Grizzly bear confrontations, territorial disputes, illness and damage throughout territory lacking physicians. Not starvation, however. They had absorbed hunting productively, adequately maintaining themselves nourished, even throughout severe winters when game proved limited and dispersed. Contrast this against numerous wagon train immigrants traversing identical geography throughout the 1840s and 1850s. These travelers frequently struggled hunting successfully, despite possessing comparable weapons. They crashed through landscape, generating noise and depositing odor traces, alerting every deer throughout the zone to their existence. They didn't comprehend wind configurations, lacked patience for still hunting, and frequently returned from hunting expeditions without anything. The difference wasn't the rifles. The difference was understanding. The wagon train hunters treated the mountains like the farmlands they'd left behind. The mountain men had learned to treat the mountains on the mountain's own terms. The mountain men's hunting techniques represented foundational deer behavior, comprehension, extending substantially past merely understanding shooting mechanics. They comprehended deer inhabited a realm governed by odor detection, and any hunting approach neglecting wind direction was destined toward restricted achievement. This comprehension extended toward their deer sign interpretation. A mountain man could examine a deer path and establish not merely how many deer utilized it, yet when they utilized it, and toward which direction they characteristically traveled. He would observe impression dimensions distinguishing bucks from does, waist, freshness, evaluating how recently deer had traversed, browsing mark elevation and variety, comprehending what deer consumed and consequently where they grazed. He would additionally pursue friction marks on timber where bucks abraded their antlers against bark marking territory and strengthening neck musculature throughout the rut. These friction marks indicated not merely that bucks existed throughout the zone, yet furnished information regarding their dimensions based on the friction mark elevation and intensity, and the direction they probably traveled based on friction mark configuration through forest. This information abundance permitted a proficient hunter constructing a cognitive chart of deer activity throughout his hunting zone. He knew where deer grazed, where they rested, which paths they utilized shifting between these zones, and when they proved most probable existing at any specific position. Equipped with this understanding and meticulous wind direction consideration, he could situate himself for achievement reliably. Deer seasonal conduct additionally factored into the mountain man's hunting approach. They comprehended that throughout the rut, characteristically throughout late autumn, bucks grew less wary and more active throughout daylight hours. This was when even characteristically cautious, mature bucks might be discovered shifting through exposed zones, pursuing does, and momentarily relinquishing certain defensive wariness. A buck consumed by the breeding urge made mistakes, and mountain men learned to exploit those mistakes. Mountain men additionally knew that throughout severe winter circumstances, deer concentrated throughout particular zones where sustenance remained accessible, and protection from wind and deep snow could be discovered. These winter territories were more compact and more foreseeable than deer summer territories, rendering hunting simpler for individuals, knowing where to pursue. Throughout severe winters, when deep snow restricted deer movement, a proficient hunter could maintain his camp furnished with relative simplicity. The deer had no choice but to concentrate in areas where they could survive. Find those areas, and you found the deer. The technique truly distinguishing mountain man hunting apart was their utilization of what we might designate psychological deer behavior comprehension. They didn't conceive deer as quarry for pursuit, yet as creatures whose configurations could be forecasted and leveraged. This mentality transformation was essential. A hunter perceiving deer as quarry for pursuit would instinctively desire shifting swiftly, traversing geography, actively pursuing game. A hunter comprehending deer as configuration following creatures that could be intercepted would decelerate, observe more, and situate himself tactically rather than traversing distance arbitrarily. This patient, observant method demanded a contrasting disposition than the active hunting numerous men favored. Certain mountain men never cultivated patience for still hunting or ambush methods. They persisted hunting by traversing geography swiftly, expecting to observe deer and secure a mobile shot. These hunters experienced their achievements, yet their achievement proportion was substantially inferior to individuals who perfected the slower, more calculated techniques. They might get lucky occasionally, but luck wasn't reliable in the mountains. Skill was. The records surviving from the mountain man period frequently reference particular individuals recognized for their hunting capability. These men were appreciated throughout their brigades and organizations, not merely for delivering meat, yet for their geography and game conduct understanding. They frequently functioned as guides and scouts, positions demanding identical observational proficiencies, rendering them accomplished hunters. A single mountain man hunting aspect meriting specific consideration is their unconditional necessity executing the initial shot successfully. With a single-shot flintlock demanding 30 seconds or beyond for reloading, no possibility existed for a subsequent shot on a mobile deer. This indicated shot positioning was crucial. Mountain men absorbed anticipating broadside presentations where they could target heart and lungs, the critical zone guaranteeing swift, merciful kills. They declined shots at deer confronting them or shifting away, angled approaches where the ball might not penetrate critical organs, or shots at deer that were vigilant and prepared fleeing at the shot's sound. This discipline proved challenging to maintain when you'd been hunting for hours or days lacking achievement. The temptation of accepting a marginal shot at a deer that might not furnish superior possibility is powerful. Mountain men absorbed that an inadequately positioned shot wounding a deer without cleanly eliminating it indicated forfeited meat and devastated hunting throughout that zone for the predictable future, superior declining the shot and anticipating superior possibility. A wounded deer that escaped taught every other deer in the area that humans were dangerous. It could ruin hunting for weeks. The actual shooting technique additionally reflected the mountain men's meticulous method. They didn't shoot freehand when avoidable. Rather, they would position the extended barrel of their firearm across a tree branch, against a tree trunk, or across a stone, steadying their targeting. This not merely enhanced precision, yet additionally assisted, guaranteeing the firearm indicated the correct location on the deer when the shot discharged. The ignition postponement of a flintlock, the momentary interval between trigger activation and the primary charge discharging, demanded supplementary proficiency. A hunter required maintaining flawless targeting through this postponement, not reacting or shifting as the pan ignition occurred. Mountain men implemented this perpetually, dry discharging their firearms, cultivating muscle memory, essentially maintaining sight alignment through the shot. They practiced until the flash in the pan became invisible to them, until their aim stayed true regardless of what their eyes saw or their nerves felt. All the shooting proficiency globally couldn't surmount inadequate situating, however. This is why wind and odor comprehension grew so fundamental to mountain man-hunting achievement. You could be the premier shot throughout the mountains, yet if deer detected your odor before you observed them, you never received a shooting opportunity. The mountain men's hunting techniques additionally modified to the distinct mule deer characteristics, the fundamental deer species throughout substantial Rocky Mountain portions. Mule deer conducted themselves contrarily than white-tailed deer numerous mountain men had hunted throughout the East. When startled, whitetails characteristically flee in a continuous trajectory, traversing geography swiftly. Mule deer, however, frequently bounce in a distinctive stotting movement and regularly halt after fleeing a brief separation to reverse and evaluate the danger. Practiced mountain men absorbed utilizing this conduct. If they unintentionally alarmed a mule deer, they would frequently become motionless rather than attempting pursuing it. The deer might flee 100 yards, then halt and reverse, furnishing a stationary shot possibility. This solely functioned if the hunter had been meticulous regarding wind direction, however. Because a deer that had detected human odor wouldn't halt and reverse. It would persist fleeing. The nose never lied. If they smelled you, they were gone for good. Mule deer seasonal shifts additionally influenced hunting approach. Throughout summer, mule deer might traverse across multiple square miles, shifting between elevated feeding zones and reduced elevation resting zones. Throughout winter, however, they concentrated in more compact winter territories at reduced elevations, where snow wasn't as substantial and vegetation was reachable. A mountain man who absorbed these winter territory positions could hunt substantially more productively than one who roamed arbitrarily through mountains. The connection between mountain men and hunted deer transcended elementary predator and quarry relationships. These hunters cultivated profound admiration for deer as creatures flawlessly modified to their surroundings. They observed how deer situated themselves, observing their rear trail while grazing, how does shielded their fawns, how bucks abraded timber not merely throughout the rut, yet throughout the year marking territory. This admiration converted into hunting principles that were pragmatic, yet not extravagant. A mountain man extracted solely the meat he required, though that quantity might appear tremendous by contemporary standards. Records describe mountain men consuming 5 through 7 pounds of meat at a single meal, yet this proves logical given that game meat is sparse, and the men were consuming tremendous calories throughout their daily operations. They utilized every deer portion they could: meat for sustenance, hide for garments and footwear, sinew for stitching, bones and antlers for implements. Nothing was wasted because waste meant disrespect, and disrespect meant the mountains might not provide next time you needed them. The techniques mountain men cultivated for deer hunting additionally functioned for hunting additional game: elk, antelope, mountain sheep. The identical concepts of wind consciousness, patient pursuing, and meticulous shot positioning functioned across species. Deer, however, being more extensively distributed and existing year-round throughout most zones where mountain men functioned, remained the fundamental game creature, maintaining them nourished. By the delayed 1830s, the beaver commerce was disintegrating. Silk hats had substituted beaver felt as the stylish selection throughout European and Eastern American municipalities, and 20 years of concentrated trapping had exhausted beaver populations throughout the Rockies. The yearly rendezvous, where trappers assembled exchanging furs and resupplying, diminished each year until they terminated completely by 1840. The mountain men's hunting techniques persisted past the fur commerce, however. Numerous former trappers discovered employment as wagon train guides, as military expedition scouts, as meat providers to initial mining settlements and communities. The proficiencies they had cultivated hunting deer throughout the 1820s and 1830s functioned admirably throughout these novel positions. More significantly, their techniques influenced how hunting was implemented throughout the American West. Settlers absorbed from mountain men, either straightforwardly or through document records that commenced materializing throughout the 1840s and 1850s. The comprehension that wind direction was essential to hunting achievement, that patience surpassed urgency, that sign interpretation and game configuration comprehension mattered more than traversing geography swiftly. These lessons transferred into the wider Western hunting culture. The knowledge didn't die with the beaver trade. It evolved, adapted, and became part of the fabric of Western life. Presently, accomplished deer hunters still utilize technique variations mountain men originated. Contemporary hunters verify wind direction before selecting their stand positions. They still implement hunting, shifting gradually through timber and halting regularly for observation and listening. They examine game paths and feeding configurations. They comprehend that approaching closely matters more than possessing the most formidable firearm. The technology has transformed substantially. Contemporary firearms can eliminate cleanly at 300 yards or beyond. Odor-neutralizing garments and applications are obtainable. Trail cameras display precisely when and where deer shift through particular positions. GPS devices and satellite imagery assist hunters navigating and comprehending geography. The foundational revelation the mountain men grasped remains accurate, however. Deer inhabit a realm governed by odor, and if you desire to hunt them productively, you must pursue the wind. The secret wasn't intricate. It didn't demand specialized equipment or exceptional strength or remarkable vision. It demanded patience, observation, and willingness to decelerate and permit deer approaching you rather than pursuing them through forest. It demanded comprehending that each time you shifted through timber, you were depositing an odor trace that deer could detect substantially after you traversed. And it demanded discipline, situating yourself so wind transported your odor away from where you anticipated deer existing. Mountain men who perfected these concepts could hunt productively year after year. Individuals who didn't either absorb swiftly or didn't persist extended throughout the mountains. The margin separating achievement from failure was excessively narrow, the consequences excessively severe for unproductive hunting techniques persisting. The historical documentation demonstrates that productive hunters throughout the mountain man period weren't necessarily the premier shots or the most powerful men or individuals with the superior firearms. They were men who comprehended wind, who could interpret sign, who possessed patience anticipating hours for the proper shot possibility, and who admired the deer's defensive capabilities adequately operating within them rather than attempting surmounting them through force or velocity. This comprehension represents a foundationally contrasting hunting method than approaches prevalent throughout settled zones where group drives and hound pursuits were conventional implementation. The mountain man hunted independently or alongside a single companion throughout immense territories where deer could merely relocate if hunting pressure grew excessively concentrated. He couldn't afford educating deer to his existence. He required capturing them through surprise, and the singular consistent method accomplishing that was hunting so the deer's fundamental defense, their odor detection, couldn't identify him. These techniques' productivity is demonstrated by the elementary reality that mountain men persisted and occasionally flourished throughout an environment that eliminated less proficient hunters. They invested years, occasionally decades, inhabiting wilderness lacking stored sustenance or external provisions for months continuously. They remained vigorous and nourished, and they accomplished it with single-shot firearms and handcrafted equipment. The techniques they cultivated weren't documented throughout hunting instructions during the mountain man period. They were transmitted from practiced hunters to newcomers through demonstration and narrative at rendezvous assemblies and winter settlements. A young trapper absorbing the occupation would hunt alongside veterans who demonstrated reading wind, shifting through forest without alerting game, interpreting deer sign and forecasting where creatures would exist at varying times. This verbal tradition indicated techniques fluctuated somewhat between contrasting regions and among contrasting hunter groups. A mountain man who invested most time throughout the elevated Rockies might cultivate slightly contrasting methods than one who hunted fundamentally throughout reduced elevation forests and grasslands. The fundamental concepts, wind consciousness, patient pursuing, meticulous shot positioning, remain perpetual, however. Mountain man hunting's legacy extends past technique toward a self-sufficiency and wilderness capability philosophy that influenced American culture. The solitary hunter image, equipped solely with his firearm and his proficiencies productively harvesting game throughout wilderness, became a formidable cultural representation. It represented surroundings dominance through understanding and patience rather than technological supremacy. This philosophy stands in fascinating opposition to subsequent American hunting developments, where technology and convenience grew progressively significant. By the delayed 1800s, hunters could acquire factory-manufactured repeating firearms, commercially fabricated ammunition, and specialized garments. The proficiencies mountain men had cultivated from necessity grew less crucial as technology furnished alternatives. The techniques never completely vanished, however. Throughout every generation, certain hunters have pursued connecting with mountain men traditions to hunt in manners emphasizing proficiency and woodsmanship over technological benefit. These hunters still implement hunting. They still devote meticulous consideration to wind direction. They still pursue comprehending deer conduct and configurations rather than merely attempting shooting as numerous creatures as feasible. The mountain man deer hunting narrative is fundamentally an adaptation and absorption narrative. Men who reached the Rockies with Eastern hunting techniques swiftly discovered these approaches weren't adequately suited to Western circumstances. Individuals who adapted, who absorbed from native hunters, who devoted consideration to their surroundings and transformed their methods appropriately, succeeded. Individuals who didn't adapt struggled and frequently failed. The fundamental revelation establishing the distinction was elementary. Throughout the mountains, you don't hunt deer by pursuing them through forest. You hunt them by comprehending their configurations, situating yourself at the proper position at the proper time, and establishing absolutely certain that wind transports your odor away from where deer will exist. Execute this reliably, with patience and discipline, and your achievement proportion will increase twofold. Disregard it, and you'll starve regardless of shooting proficiency. That's the secret mountain men uncovered and accomplished deer hunters still utilize presently. It's not spectacular or thrilling. It doesn't generate dramatic narratives of mobile pursuits or remarkable extended distance shots. It's merely productive, confirmed across nearly 2 centuries of Western hunting, and everything reduces to a single elementary concept. Pursue the wind, and the deer will approach you.